Hello, and welcome to the Life and Liberty podcast. I am Sharayah Colter from the Danbury Institute, and today we are talking with Rod Martin, who is the founder and CEO of Martin Capital, and also writes at rodmartin.org, where he offers daily geopolitical analysis. He's also a tech entrepreneur and an investor, and was part of the team that started PayPal. So he is an insightful person, and today we have him on to talk a little bit about a very, hot topic right now, Rod, Islamification of America, and also how that intertwines with still being people who protect religious liberty in America. So thank you, Rod, so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Well, thank you. And we do need to take this seriously. The Muslim population is on track to double in this country over the next several years. They will outnumber the Jewish population in very short order, possibly early 2030s. So we're talking about an interest group that is going to have significant presence in our society, in our institutions, and we need to understand it. So the first thing you have to understand is what you and I were talking about recently with regard to socialism. It's a Christian heresy. In the case of socialism, it actually purports to posit an atheology, rather than a spiritual worldview. But the result is the same. It just transfers all of the attributes of godhood to the state, and you must worship the state in effect. I mean, you wouldn't call it that, God forbid. We're all good atheists in communism, but that is exactly what it is. And you see it at the end of 1984, George Orwell's famous book, where O'Brien is trying to break Winston, and he finally has him to the point where he's willing to admit that, yes, 2 + 2 actually equals 5. And he's refused to do that up to this point. He's finally ready to break. And O'Brien says, 2 + 2 equals whatever the party tells you. Okay, that's a claim to godhood, and we see it in transgenderism. We see it in all these different things where suddenly the party or the state, respectively, begins to redefine reality. That's a claim to godhood. That's what Eve was doing by eating the fruit. So how is Islam different? Well, Islam is an actual theistic heresy, and it's explicitly Christian in its origin. You have in Islam a belief that all of the Old Testament prophets are part of the prophets list for Islam, and Jesus was a good man and a great prophet. Certainly not the Son of God, certainly not the Redeemer, but very important man in Islamic thought. And then, of course, God's final prophet, and by God, I certainly don't mean Jehovah, I mean Allah, the Arabic word for that, it revealed his final and full understanding of all things to Muhammad somehow. And somehow it turns every Christian virtue on its head in the same way that Marxism does, just a little bit different directions. What you get is an incredibly tyrannical system that also believes in an unlimited revolution. They would call it jihad, that subsumes the entire world. And that's exactly what they did in the first century following Muhammad's rise. They overran all of Christian North Africa, all of the Christian Middle East, all of Persia, got into India, conquered Spain, actually marched on Tours in France. Charles the Hammer's anniversary of the Battle of Tours was just in October. Christendom was saved in that battle. And all of this is because Islam believes in imposing its worldview and its legal requirements by the sword. It's not about conversion, it's about force, which, again, is just like socialism. So, what do we have to face in America? Well, the fact is, as this rises as a percentage of population, we're going to see more and more efforts to force the people around them, what the Quran would call dhimmis, which are people who are in subjugation to the Muslims, but not actually Muslims themselves. And they have inferior rights, and they have to pay a tax to the Muslims, and blah, blah, blah. We're going to see an increasing effort to reduce American citizens to demihood in a number of places, Dearborn, obviously, Minneapolis, other places. And as that rises, we're going to have to defend the American idea and our constitutional system. And the best possible way to do that is to actually not be embarrassed of our Christian worldview. They are not embarrassed of theirs. The socialists are not embarrassed of theirs. They cite Das Kapital and the Quran as authority. We have to be willing to cite the Bible as authority, not to force anybody to do anything, but to prevent others from forcing themselves on us. That is the essence of the American system. We have freedom of religion. We have lots of wonderful things. We're not a theocracy other than King Jesus, but we absolutely are rooted in Christian thought. And you wouldn't have a separation of powers. You wouldn't have all of the systems that we've put in place to balance powers against each other so that deliberation must happen. You wouldn't have a First Amendment if it hadn't been Christians designing it. And we have to stand on that, and we have to be honest about why that came from us and why it matters.
So important. I think as people are seeing this, for some time it was, it's all in that state or it's in that city and I don't live there, so I can kind of put it out of my mind. But I think like you're talking about, we're seeing this kind of explode on a national level. It's in a lot of places. People are wondering, am I going to have to hear the call to prayer in my neighborhood? And what does that look like? Am I going to be, asked or told to, dress a certain way? So these are things and questions that are becoming, I think, a little bit more real to people. As you said, the population is growing. So what do you think people, normal, average, everyday Christians can do, when they are starting to realize, hey, I have some problems with this. I don't want to be, uh, you know, operating according to Sharia law. I see that on the news. I see that's kind of coming down the pike. What do I do, and how do I have a right understanding about handling this?
Well, and that may sound crazy, but it isn't, because we're seeing it across Europe. We're seeing ostensibly liberal democracies, liberal in the non Democrat Republican sense, in the classical liberal sense, supposedly liberal democracies allowing Sharia courts to be established that are separate and apart from the governmental system and actually have force of law and be able to enforce their judgments according to the Quran. That's messed up. That's really, really problematic. And of course, as that continues, pretty soon you have government courts that are also enforcing Sharia law. And we've certainly seen way too much of that since the whole rape gang scandal burst on the scene in Great Britain. All of this is aimed at turning these countries into Islamic republics, not, republic meaning dictatorship, not unlike Iran. And they're making tremendous progress in some of these places. Now, will they hear? Our system is a little harder to subvert in that way, but it won't be if the Democrats badly undermine the separation of powers, which they spent all of Biden's term doing for sure. And if they censor us where we can't speak about it, which they tried to do all through Biden's 4 years, and as Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada have done. We should not think this is crazy conspiracy talk. We see it in Great Britain. Thousands of people at this point have been jailed in the United Kingdom for posting memes. Thousands of people, while rapists go free because they're Muslims. And it's just that simple. And you just look at that and the mind boggles. The United Kingdom is supposedly, at worst, the second freest country in the world behind us. But that's totalitarianism. And it's totalitarianism from an alien religion that has no roots in Great Britain. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because they don't have a lot of Christians, and most of those Christians have been asleep. In America, we have a lot more, but our Christians are asleep too. And if we don't combat this in the marketplace of ideas, we will end up at some point combating it on the battlefield.
And we don't have to look back very far in history to see COVID as a time, even in America, where it was not quite so free as we thought. You know, Great Britain certainly is, worse off than we are, but we saw a lot of infringement of free speech, even that the Supreme Court is now dealing with. But, and as well as I do, that people can be and have been arrested for praying in their heads in Great Britain. So this is not something that people, like you said, this is not a conspiracy theory, and these are not things that can't happen. They do and are happening. And so we have to take serious stock of what's going on. How would you respond to, these certain communities that are becoming popular that are all Muslim in areas where they're, naming the streets that way? I mean, it's really, you feel like you have entered an alternate universe a little bit when they're taking over large amounts of space and really saying like, hey, this is how we're going to live here, and we're going to expand. How do you look at that?
Well, I think you look at it on two levels. If you come to have a Muslim majority in, say, Dearborn, Michigan, and they want to run things the way they want to run things, and it's different from us, okay, that's fine. I mean, it's a free country. Do what you want, up to the point at which you infringe our rights. This is the essence of liberty. And of course, the socialists are always telling us that you have a positive right to somebody else's income, that you have a right to free health care. Well, I don't have a right to free health care because that would force somebody else to provide it to me. I don't have a right to all these things they say they want to give me because someone would be forced, enslaved, basically, to provide them to me one way or another. Well, likewise here, we believe as a people, as a civilization, and certainly as Christians, that your rights end where somebody else's begin. So I have negative rights. That's the unfortunate terminology, but it makes sense. I have the right to not be slapped. I have the right to not be punched. I have the right to not have my stuff taken from me. I have the right to not have my children indoctrinated against my will. These are the kinds of rights I have. I have the right to not be prevented from speaking out. And we have to use those rights. If they want to impose Sharia law in Dearborn or Minneapolis, okay, up to a certain point, that's just a preference. But beyond a certain point, it violates the Bill of Rights. It violates the traditional rights understood to pertain to all people in Anglo-American law that we, more than our British friends, believe are derived entirely from God and not the state. Now, that's where I would just point out this red-green alliance that is formed. The Muslims and the socialists, personified in one man, in Zohran Mamdani in New York, the Muslims and the socialists both want a top-down system. Both want a system that's based on force, that is based on the whims of the ruling elite, and they want your stuff. So they are allying because America's in the way of that. And that's what we're seeing. That's why you have these masses of people in the streets cheering on Hamas, which is one of the most murderous groups of people in the history of the world. Even if you didn't like Israel, you can't possibly support Hamas, but they are. Why? Because Hamas wants to destroy America. And the socialists also want to destroy America. For that matter, the delegitimization of Israel, claiming that land that belonged to them in the thousands BC somehow isn't theirs, and they're colonizers and they don't have a right to be there. Well, it's absurd historically, but more to the point, it is aimed not at Israel, but at the United States. The idea is very simple. If you delegitimize the presence of Jewish people in Israel, how much easier is it to delegitimize a country that is largely composed of settlers from Europe and other places that only arose in the last few centuries? That's what they're really aiming at. All of this is aimed at tearing down America because America is the bulwark of Christian civilization. And that's the real target. They want to end Christian civilization and replace it with their own.
Wow. What a warning for all of us to heed that this is coming down the pike, that our way of life really is, something we must stand up and defend and take action, to speak out and to defend it. Would you guess just leave us with one last word, Rod, on just an encouragement toward especially pastors? Um, how can you encourage them to stand up, be bold in the pulpit within their congregations, to lead them well, to yes, exude the love of Christ and his grace, but also to just be, bearers of truth?
Well, we absolutely must be. We're required to be. We are put here as stewards, and most of us are not put here as pastors. So, if we take the illustration in Paul of the body of Christ at all seriously, if we believe that people are gifted differently with different spiritual and physical gifts that are not dispersed evenly, and that they all work together as a seamless whole in the Lord, then we also have to believe that all these other people's jobs are also callings. Maybe a calling for just a short time. Maybe you're not called to be a janitor at Taco Bell for more than 10 minutes, but while you're there, you need to do a great job, or people may slip and fall, or people may get food poisoning. Bad things can happen. So we need to treat everything as though unto the Lord. And when we do that and we take that seriously and we understand that our role is not just our job, it's not just, leading our families, it's not just, serving in the nursery down at the church, but we're also citizens. We actually have civic duties, and God expects us to steward all the things that are put in our reach. So we have to understand it. We have to embrace that. And our pastors have to teach it. If they don't teach it, they're not teaching the full counsel. And it's just going to be a disaster. Bottom line on all of it. There was a country song a few years ago, you may recall, that the key line was, there's more of us than there are of them. And in America, there are. That wasn't true for the Christians in Great Britain. The church in Great Britain's been dying off for 100 years. But in America, the church is still very, very strong. And the nuns have stopped growing. So we're seeing a lot of pushback, especially with younger men coming back to the church, taking their faith seriously. It's time we understand that if we let this country go, we are choosing to do it. Whether we are doing it through dereliction or we're doing it willfully makes no difference. We have the power to prevent these evils from happening. If we don't use that power, we're going to stand before the great white throne and be judged for it.
Wow, what a word. Thank you, Rod Martin, so much for your insight on this and just everything you have to offer and everything you're writing. We really appreciate your contribution to all of Christendom.
Thank you. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it, and I appreciate Danbury and all that you guys do.
Thank you so much, Rod. We appreciate you. Have a good one.
Take care.
This has been an edition of the Life and Liberty podcast of the Danbury Institute. The Danbury Institute is an association of churches, Christians, and organizations aligned to affirm and preserve God-given rights to life and liberty. To learn more, visit danburyinstitute.org. The work of the Danbury Institute relies on generous patriots like you. To support, visit danburyinstitute.org/give.